Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining this session. Thank you also to Apex Hours for inviting me. Today we're going to talk about Slack plus Salesforce development. We're going to see how to build a Slack app that integrates with Salesforce, and we are going to see how to do it with the features that are currently available, but we will also see what we have in the roadmap, a pilot that is going to make it much easier to do this kind of integrations with Salesforce and Slack. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a Salesforce developer advocate, and in here you have my contact details in case that you have questions. I always respond. So as I work for Salesforce, I need to include this slide, which just means that you should make purchasing decisions based on the functionality that is generally available. And today I'm going to talk about a pilot, but it's a pilot that is in really good shape and that I'm sure that you all are going to love. So to talk about Slack plus Salesforce development, we're going to start by taking a look at a demo. I'm going to demo an app that some colleagues together with myself have created. And enough with slide. Let's take a look at the demo directly. Okay. So here I am in Slack. I'm in a workspace, in a test workspace in which I have several apps installed. And the app that have created is called Ready to Fly. It is called Ready to Fly because it allows you to um, manage travel approval requests when you need to do a trip, a work trip, right? It allows you to manage those travel approval requests directly from Slack, but the backend in which those travel approval requests are stored is Salesforce, is a Salesforce organization. So here we can see our list of travel approval requests. So the actions that we want to perform over those travel approvals are authenticated actions because, for instance, when I create a travel approval request, I want that the owner is myself, right? The user that represents my persona in Salesforce. And the way in which you map users in Slack to users in Salesforce is authorizing. So let's authorize. Click in this button. So what's going to happen now is that behind the scenes, we have implemented the user-to-user authorization flow in this Slack application. This is something that you can reuse in your apps. You don't have to do it from scratch, and I will tell you later how to scaffold an app that does this. Let me see if I can change. No. I want to change off tab. I'm going to need to do this. Okay, and let me reorganize my tab again because this. Okay, okay, fixed. So what happened is that I was redirected to another tab, a new tab in the browser, and I didn't know how to go back to the previous tab I had opened. So now I have my Slack user connected to my Salesforce user. So I'm able to see here the travel approval requests that I have created. For instance, I can see that I want to visit the London Developer Group, the JavaScript conference, whatever, whatever, right? And those are the three travel approval requests that I have created. If I'm a manager and I have some subordinates, those travel approval requests that need my attention are going to appear here in this tab, and I'm going to be able to approve or reject this travel approval request directly from here. Okay. Um, Also, something that I can do is to create a new travel approval request from Slack. Very handy. We have implemented that behavior through a global shortcut. Okay, so global shortcuts are shortcuts that you can launch from this icon here. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to look for the shortcut called Create Travel Request with Ready to Fly, and I'm going to click on it. So now a mobile is going to appear. This is part of the application that we have created. So what I'm going to do is to create an approval request that lets me travel to, I don't know, the moon, maybe. Sorry, this is the origin. So I'm currently in Navarra, which is the place where I was born, and I want to go to the moon. The start day of the trip is going to be on the 21st of July, okay? And my trip is going to finish on the 30th of July. The cost is going to be, ooh, must be expensive, so it's going to be 600,000 euros. And I'm going to select an approver. The approver, it's something that we are reading from Salesforce, from the user manager field, and it lets me select an approver from my whole management chain. Sorry, I'm going to select Peter Cheetham, who is my direct manager, and I'm going to say, please approve my request. Amazing. I'm going to submit this, and now we're going to see that if I refresh my Salesforce page, the new travel approval request should be there. There it is, this one here. All the integrations that we have seen so far start from Slack, from an action that a user performs in Slack, but we also created an integration that goes on the opposite direction. And it's an integration that starts when you change the status of a travel approval request. For instance, I'm going to imagine that now I'm Peter and I'm approving this trip that I just created, okay? And then what's going to happen is that we are going to send a message from Salesforce to Slack, and the message says that my travel approval request has been created. Amazing. So we have seen that we've been able to implement some behaviors as part of this application that respond to user actions in Slack, such as shortcuts or interaction with the app home. And we've seen also how we can go back from Salesforce to Slack. And we're going to take a look at how this app was architected, how we perform the integration with Salesforce, and I'm going to show you the code. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation and continue talking a little bit about Slack apps architecture. Okay, so when you create Slack apps, as I told you at the beginning, with the features that are currently available, okay, not with the pilot that we are going to talk about at the end of the presentation. So what happens is that what you need to create, so there is a series of APIs that allow you to interact with your Slack server, right? And what you need to do is to create a client app. You can create a client app in any language and you can run that app in any platform. But what we did for convenience was to create an app in Node.js with Node.js and run that app over Heroku. Okay? So this app is the one that is going to interact with the APIs that either fire the events that represent the interactions that the user is doing in the app, or either receive actions from that external Heroku app to change what the user is seeing in Slack. So for instance, here we have an example. A user sends a message, and if we have configured our Slack app to fire an event that represents that message, then our Slack app is going to do that. It's going to fire an event. It's going to fire this event to an endpoint of your choice. In our case, it's going to be an endpoint that we have defined in our Heroku app, and the messages are going to have to follow a JSON format, right? A particular JSON format that you can check out in the documentation. Normally, what's going to happen is that in your app, in your client app, you're going to execute some logic. In our case, normally that logic is going to access Salesforce to bring some data or to create some data. And then we are going to send that information back, not that information, sorry, but we are going to perform some actions on Slack so that we inform the user that the action executed successfully. In our case, some actions that we do are, for instance, sending the travel approval request that we retrieve from Salesforce, or showing a mobile when the travel approval request gets created, right? These kind of interactions. So really we have two APIs that we need to know. One is the events API, which is an outbound API. It fires events and we need to subscribe to those events. And then we have the web API, which is an inbound API through which we can do lots of things such as post messages, post something to the app home page, right, for an app, or we can react to messages and many more steps. So we could do these interactions, implement this interaction with these APIs directly, right, from scratch. But Slack gives us something called the Bolt framework that makes this much more easier. Okay. The Bolt framework is a framework that is implemented in three different languages. You can use it in JavaScript, Python, and Java. And with this framework, you easily create an app, that consumer app, that client app that interacts with Slack APIs, abstracting yourself from having to know all the single details of the APIs. It includes a very intuitive, readable listener pattern for the events, for listening to those events that I mentioned before. And it incorporates the latest platform features because the Slack developer relations team is always maintaining this framework. So it's a great tool to use. Okay. Then I also told you that when you want to send changes back to Slack to update the UI that the user is seeing in the Slack app, you interact with the web API, right? So when you interact with the web API to update those surfaces that the user is seeing, you can simply send, oh, sorry for that, you can simply send some plain text, or you can use something called BlockKit. Okay, BlockKit is a UI framework that Slack created to make it easier to define what you can use in a Slack surface. So if you want to take a look at what's available in BlockKit, a good option is to go to this webpage, app.slack.com/blockkitbuilder, because it is a tool that will allow you to mock up the UIs that you want to use in Slack by using drag and drop. So for instance, if I want to use, I don't know, some text fields, I can drag and drop them here, and they are going to appear here. Sorry, that didn't work. I think it's just with the plus button. Yeah, exactly. And they are going to appear here at the bottom of the UI that I'm creating. This UI that I'm seeing here is translated into this JSON code here. And this JSON code here is the BlockKit code that I can use to create like more complex, more fancy UIs. Okay? Amazing. So Some examples of surfaces in which you can include block-kit code are modals, those modals that we saw in our sample app, also messages, and also the app home tab. Indeed, we are doing that. We are using block-kit to show your travel approval requests. Additionally, if you're using the Node.js version of Bolt, okay, you can use something, a library that has been created by the Slack community called blockbuilder.dev. This library allows you to create block-kit code following a syntax very similar to the Swift UI syntax. So instead of going to that block kit builder page and create your full block kit code in JSON, what you can do is in your JavaScript code, use a series of classes and methods to create that block kit code dynamically. At the end, it's going to be JSON. You have to invoke a method called build to JSON that is going to transform it. But as you can imagine, it's a more robust way and prone to errors way of creating that block kit code that is going to represent your Slack UIs. So we've seen like the different items and technologies that we need to create that Slack app, but where do you start when you want to create that Slack app, right? You need to define it somewhere. So that is this URL here. That place is this URL here, api.slack.com/apps. And I'm going to that URL so that you can see the Slack apps that I have created. So here I have some test apps that I have created in the past and our ready to fly app. If I go into my ready to fly app configuration, this is going to contain a definition of the app. And through that definition, is how you can install your app in the different workspaces you want to use it. In our case, we are using a test workspace. By the way, test workspaces are completely free. You can create one. You can install this app yourself. So a Slack app has a set of configuration values. Okay, for instance, the app credentials. The app credentials is something that you are going to need to use in your Heroku app or in your consumer app to tell Bolt how to connect to Slack. We have things such as the definition of the events that our app is firing, okay? And the definition of the endpoint to which our app is firing or sending those events. Indeed, we can take a look here that it is the endpoint that we defined in our Heroku app, okay? And we have other things such as, for instance, the slash commands that we have defined, the shortcuts that we have defined. Remember that we use the global shortcuts to create the travel approval requests, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so this app configuration defines what this piece of the architecture. Let me go back 1 second to the architecture schema. Okay, it defines what this piece of the architecture is going to do. It's not something that we define with code. We define it in this web page here, but There is something that we can do to store this configuration in a repo, for instance, which is to copy or download the app manifest. So the app manifest is the definition of the application, is a mirror of all the configuration values that we have selected here in the different sections of the app configuration page. And you can store your app manifests first, sorry, in YAML or JSON. Okay. Then this is going to be very useful because it's like backup of the configuration values that you selected for your app, but also at the same time it's going to be useful if you want to migrate that app to another account, another Slack account. So this is my Slack account, but if you have a Slack account to develop your own apps, and you want to create my Ready to Fly app, you can simply do create new app from manifest and use my manifest file to copy all that configuration values to your own Slack account. Okay, so let me continue with this. And let's continue talking about the Salesforce part. I haven't talked yet about how you integrate this app with Salesforce. And we do that thanks to our Heroku app. What we did was to, in that Heroku app, use a library called JSForce that is in charge of interacting with Salesforce APIs. We interact with Salesforce APIs to read those travel approval requests data, for instance, and we interact with Salesforce APIs to um, create new travel approval requests. Also, in the last integration I showed, the one in which we are changing a travel approval request status in Salesforce, and then Salesforce publishes a message to Slack, we're doing that by using an HTTP callout from Apex. Okay, we are in executing that HTTP callout, and we are reading that HTTP callout in Heroku, and then we are interacting with Slack using bot. We could have done that integration directly with another feature that Slack has called incoming webhooks, but we didn't because we needed a little more flexibility, and I will explain you a little more about that later while showing to you the code. And by the way, this icon here represents Bolt, the framework that we are using to interact with Slack. So JS Force, I'm sure that you are familiar with it, but in case you are not, this is the web page in which you can download it. It's a JavaScript polymorphic, no, sorry, isomorphic library that works both in the browser and in the server. Great. So enough with the slides, right? Let's take a look at the code. The code of this app is available. It's at github.com/trailheadapps slash ready to fly. I was going to tell you that to take a look at the code, first I want to take as an example one of the flows that we are using. Okay, the flow that the integration that occurs when you open that app homepage. So what happens when you open the homepage? So first, the user performs that interaction with Slack. Slack, as we've configured the app to fire that event, is going to fire an event called app home opened event. Then we're going to listen to that event in our Heroku app, and we're going to use JS Force to read the travel approval request from Salesforce. Then Salesforce is going to return those travel approval requests. We are going to create our block kit code using that library, JavaScript library that I explained to you before. And finally, we're going to send that blocked code to Slack through the web API. So, next thing that we're going to do is that we are going to take a look at the code. So here we have our package.json file. And in our package.json file, we have defined the different libraries with which we have a dependency. We have a dependency, as we can see here, with, let me take a look. Okay, it's not this app here, is this one here. We have a dependency with Slack Bolt. This is the framework that we're using to connect to Slack and interact with Slack APIs. Then we have a dependency with JSForce, which is the other library that we are using to interact with Slack. So, um, our app is this app here. So we have really two apps, but we have used a single repo for that. We have the Salesforce part, is some code that we're going to deploy to Salesforce that includes our connected app, for instance, to implement that user-to-user authorization flow that we mentioned at the beginning. And we have a folder called apps in which we have our Node.js app, that middleware app, consumer app that we are running on Heroku. In this app is where we are using Bolt, and the entry point of the applications is this app.js file. Here we can see how we are importing some classes from our Slack Bolt site. And what we are doing is to initialize the app. Normally, your code is going to be much more simple, but here I have a little bit more of code because we implemented some security mechanisms in place to make sure that those integrations between Salesforce and Slack are following all the security best practices. So if you need an integration with Salesforce, I recommend you to use as a base this code setup. But if you are just creating an app for Slack, your app.js file is going to be much simpler. So we define a series of things. For instance, we register some listeners, those listeners that are going to be listening for those events that the Slack API is going to publish, right? We are adding an authorization layer, which is the user-to-user authorization flow implementation. And then finally, what we are going to do is to start the app. This is really an express app behind the scenes. So what we are doing is to start that express server. Okay. And indeed, we can extend the app to include some custom express functionality if needed. So, this is the entry point for the application. I told you that we're going to start by taking a look at the code that is related to that flow that I explained, the one that starts when the user opens the app home. And we can take a look at our entry point for that, which is a listener. Okay, as the app home opened event is an event is going to its listener is going to go into the events folder. This is an opinionated folder structure that we are following, and it was a recommendation from the Slack team, the Slack DevRel team, right? And what we are doing here is to define a listener. So the listeners are going to be Node.js functions that have an structure that receive as a parameter client, event, and context, okay? Sometimes they receive other kind of parameters, but these are the most common ones that we are going to see. The client is contains a reference to the event that was fired by by the events API and that made this listener fire. The event is the event itself, okay, the app home opened event. And finally, the context is a parameter that allows you to pass some values between the global middleware, the authorization global middleware that we are using, and the rest of the code. So, what we are doing here, sorry, I forgot to say that the client also contains a reference to the web API. So it's the object that we are going to use to interact to that web API. So here, what we are doing, we've moved this function into another mm, class into another file really because we are reusing it somewhere else, but it's something that could be here as well in the listener definition. And what do we do in the listener? So first of all, we check if the user is correctly authorized with Salesforce. Okay, we take a look at that. This is something that the global middleware, the authorization middleware that we implemented is checking. And then, if that's the case, if the user has authorized correctly, what we do is to obtain a connection to Salesforce using that JS Force library that I mentioned before. Then we query the travel request using that JS Force library. It's very easy to use. There is a query method to which you can pass a SQL query. And then, obviously, this method returns those travel requests, but in a format which is not the block-it format that we are expecting. So, what we do is that we need to transform that format, those travel requests to the block-it format, and we do that in this function here. Okay, this is a function that lives in the sorry, in the user interface folder. Is because we are following this opinionated structure that I told you. We want to have code modularized and separated in different folders. And the way in which we convert those travel requests that Salesforce has returned to block-it code is we iterate over them and we use some elements from the Slack block builder library to create the blocks that we want to send to Slack. Once we have that code, that block-it code, note here that we are converting it to JSON because at the end block-it is JSON. Then what we do is to call a method from the web API. I told you that the client parameter is our connection to the web API, right? We call a method from there to publish this block-it code into the app home page. And we do that asynchronously because obviously this is an asynchronous function that needs to operate that way for a better user experience. So that's how this flow that starts from Slack works. I hope that you have now an idea of how this works. I told you that there is an authorization middleware that's happening every time, that is executing every time that a listener is fired. And that authorization middleware is here, okay? There is a class called Salesforce Auth that is the one that performs all the connection with Salesforce. And if the user is not authorized, shows to the user that button to authorize with Salesforce. So now let's take a look at another flow. the flow that starts from Salesforce. In Salesforce, remember, we can change the status of a travel approval request, and what we can do is to send an HTTP call out to one of our Heroku endpoints, and then from that Heroku app, execute some logic to create the blocked code that we are going to send to Slack to tell the user A, your travel request was approved, or your travel approval request was rejected. Okay, as I told you, there is a mechanism to do this directly, but you are going to understand in a second why we did it this way. And it's because we wanted to include some security mechanisms in that code. So I'm going to close all these tabs, and we're going to take a look at the Salesforce code. So the Salesforce code, as I told you, is in the Force app folder, sorry, as same as with any other Salesforce app, right? And here we have a class which is the travel request trigger handler that contains the logic that is being executed when those travel requests change, right? This is a trigger handler that we are calling from the travel request trigger. So what we are doing is every time that the request changes, well, first we check if there are records for the user that who is the owner of that travel request, because we are storing authorization records in Salesforce, and we know that way if the user is authorized or not, right? If the user is authorized, we know it at this point, and we can decide if we post a message or not. And if the user is authorized, then what we do is to create a message that is going to contain some information, and we call an HTTP callout to post that information to our Heroku app. That HTTP callout is defined in the Slack service class and is this method here. So what we do is to send a request. The body is going to contain the message that we want to publish and the information about the user to which we want to post that message. And we are going to execute that callout in the regular way that you execute callouts. The endpoint is defined in a name credential for security, and this is the detail that I wanted to tell you about security. That something that we are doing is to add an HMAC signature that then we will check on the Heroku app to make sure that Salesforce is the entity who is publishing that message and not someone else, okay? And also that the message has not been tampered with. If you don't know what this is, we have a good blog post in the Salesforce developer blog called encryption recipes, I think it's called, or encryption mechanisms in Apex. So make sure to take a look. But basically, what we do is to compute a signature with the body of the message and an HMAC key, something that we have securely stored both in Salesforce and in Heroku, and we add that signature on the header of the request. So then later in the Heroku app, we will need to recompute that signature and check if the signatures match. If they match, it will mean that the message has not been tampered with and that the origin was Salesforce. And if they don't match, we will consider that it's an error or a problem with that callout. So let's take a look at how we define that logic in our Heroku app. In our Heroku app, we have, it's not a listener, sorry, it's not a middleware, it's a custom HTTP route. This one here, okay? Custom HTTP routes are custom routes that you expose so that external systems can reach out to your Heroku app or your Bolt app. Okay, we added these HTTP routes into the Express server that is working behind our Bolt app. And all that configuration is on the app.js file. So here, what do we do? So this is the message handler, is the code that is going to execute when a call out reaches that route. And the first thing that we are going to do is to retrieve the signature from the header, the signature that Salesforce sent. Then we are going to recompute the HMAC signature using a key is the same key that we have in Salesforce. We have that key stored in both systems and with the body. If the signatures don't match, sorry, then we're going to respond with an error. And if they match, we're going to continue with the execution. And depending on the contents of the message, we are going to create some blocked code. It may be that the message was approved or rejected. And then we are going to post that message using the web API to the correct user. Remember that the client parameter is the one that gives us access to the web API and that allows us to interact with Slack, changing the UI for whatever user we want to do it. Okay? Obviously, a user that has the app installed. Amazing. So that's it. Well, here is where we are saying to the Heroku app that when we receive a post request on the Salesforce message route, this is the function that we need to execute. That is this function here. Great. So let me go back to the slides and continue talking a little bit of how we have defined this app so that it's easier for you to deploy the app and also to reuse its code. So to deploy the app, we created a script. It's going to be very simple. All the instructions are on the README of the repo that I shared before, github.com/trailheadapps slash ready to fly. Okay. And is a very simple script that you have to execute and to which you will have to provide some values. The script is going to create the Heroku app for you, is going to create your Salesforce as a test Salesforce organization for you, is going to deploy the code, the Node.js code to Heroku and the Salesforce code to Salesforce, and you will need to create your Slack, the Slack configuration app yourself, but you can do that through an app manifest that we provide. So it's going to be super simple. Then something important to share is that this app that I shown is called Ready to Fly, and we built this app because we wanted to have a meaningful use case to show in presentations, okay? But Ready to Fly has been really built on top on something else that is really uh, the code that you would need to create an app like this one from scratch, but without having the use cases implemented, which is the Salesforce Slack Starter Kit. Okay, this is a repo that contains all the deployment scripts, all the app scaffolding, the authorization flows that are implemented to interact with Salesforce, and the dependency with Bolt and JS Force. Okay, and if you want to start an app from scratch, I recommend you to go directly to this repo, which is sfdc.co/starterkit. You can clone it from there. Conversely, if what you want to do is to see Ready to Fly in action, you can go to the repo that I shared at the beginning, okay? Just bear in mind that Ready to Fly has built has been built on top of the starter kit, and that is just because we wanted to add a couple more use cases, but both of them follow the same architecture, and one uses the other. This is the URL for the starter kit. And finally, let's take a look a bit at the roadmap, what's coming. So you've seen that creating an app that integrates Salesforce with Slack at the moment is a bit complicated because you need that middleware app. And even though we're providing you with the starter kit, it needs a lot of steps and understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. Okay. So we wanted to simplify that in Salesforce, and for that we have created something called the Apex SDK for Slack. This is a pilot. This is currently in pilot, but it's coming very soon. Okay, so with this SDK, you are going to be able to manage your Slack apps directly from Salesforce. The need of having a Heroku app, a middleware app in the middle, is going to disappear. That app is not going to be needed anymore, and you're going to be able to manage your Slack apps completely in full from Salesforce. The Slack app is going to be a new metadata type that you can deploy into your Salesforce org and that you can install to Slack workspace. And from Slack, from Salesforce, from Apex, you're going to be able to define event listeners. So don't need to define event listeners in Node or Python or Java anymore. You can do that directly from Apex and also interact with the web API. So we're going to be able from Apex to post messages to that Slack app, to show modals to that Slack app users, and so on. We're going also something that is very interesting of this Apex SDK is that they have improved how you create that blocked code, creating a system built, a framework built with YAML. Okay, so when you use this Apex SDK pilot, you will be able to create your interfaces in YAML and use something called data providers that are going to make that framework super powerful. I can tell you because I have already taken a look and it's very, very interesting. If you want to take a look at some sessions that talk about the Apex SDK for Slack, make sure to take a look at our YouTube channel because my colleague Stefan Garcia did some. Finally, I want to share some resources. First, you have the GitHub repo for our Ready to Fly app and the starter kit code. There is a blog post series in which we explain in depth everything about this app, and also some parts of the app were live coded by my colleagues Mo and Kevin. So if you like code lives, you can watch this series. Also, there is a demo of the app, the demo that I did at the beginning. You can take a look at that. It's uploaded in YouTube. And there is a Trailhead project that guides you through the setup of the sample app. Okay, so we have arrived to the end of the presentation. I'm sorry I had to pre-record this session because I wasn't available on the day that the talk was going to have place, but make sure to connect. Well, here you have the Twitter handle and everything for Salesforce developers, but I'm going to show you again my Twitter handle and my email so that you can connect with me after the session in case you have any questions. And also you can post those questions in the YouTube video because I will be taking a look at it. Okay? Finally, I want to tell you thank you so much for watching and hope that you like the presentation. Bye bye.